The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord.
After leaving the mountain, Jesus and his disciples made their way through Galilee. And he did not want anyone to know because he was instructing his disciples. He was telling them, the Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of men. They will be put to death. And 3 days later, he has put to death, he will rise again. But they did not understand what he said. And they were afraid to ask. They came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" And they said nothing, because they had been arguing about which of them was the greatest. So he sat down, called the 12 to him, and said, "If anyone wants to be first, he must make himself last, and last of all, and servant of all." He then took a little child and sat him in front of them. He put his arms around him and said to them, "Anyone who welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
The Gospel of Mark is divided into two halves. And the literal half, chapter 8, occurs in Caesarea Philippi, when they have made their journey to the furthest outpost away from Jerusalem, where they have had to settle the identity of Jesus, where they've heard now, for the first time, that the Son of Man must suffer and die, where Peter starts remonstrating with Jesus, and Jesus calls him a Satan. That's the half. The first half of the gospel, there's lots of miracles and lots of great stuff, and the crowd and the energy is getting bigger and better all the time. And then you reach to this midpoint, and from there they go up the mountain where he's transfigured, and from there you know that there's one destiny for this whole gospel. It's heading in one direction, and that is straight to Jerusalem, straight to Calvary, straight to the cross. And so you have the gospel destined to Caesarea Philippi, to the Mount of Transfiguration, and then to the mountain of the cross. We think of the ministry of Jesus as this incredibly successful ministry, step after step, success after success, day after day, more and bigger and better things happening. That's not the truth. The truth is that he goes to this high point where his identity is defined, and then he goes to this other high point where Peter, James, and John are with him, and Moses and Elijah, and then he goes to this other high point where he's on the cross. We haven't come to terms with the meaning of the cross as yet. But I suppose it's only 2,000 years, It ain't that long, It's really not that long. I mean, in the grand scheme of human history, 2,000 years is a joke. It's a real joke. It's taken us hundreds of thousands, millions of years to come to the place where we know how to defend ourselves so we could survive. And in our defending of ourselves, all the battles and wars that we fight for survival's sake. It'll take us a while to understand the mystery of the cross and what that means in our human living in an everyday sense. If you take that second reading, actually, no, before I go to the second reading, we as church right now, we are living in the second half of Mark's gospel. Can you hear that? We are heading one direction, You know that? You know when you have a GPS, you set up your GPS, you have to tell the GPS where you're going? Huh? Well, when you set up your GPS, just put direction Calvary. That's where we're heading. And you know the GPS is God's positioning system. Eh? You know that? So our GPS is set for Calvary. That's where we're going. And that's where the second half of Mark is going. That's where the church is heading. And we're doing well. We're en route. And it's feeling really great. Correct? And we wake up every day and say, yes, Lord, give me that cross. I can't wait for the one that's coming today. Correct? Exactly. Exactly. If we understand that the dynamic that we're living through right now is the dynamic of the gospel, and if we understand that the gospel is speaking to the reality of what we are facing as church, international and local, if we understand that the church today is in one of the worst crises it has ever been in. This is worse than the Protestant Reformation, as bad as that was. Our people are leaving the church in droves. We know that. You know it from your children. Why ain't you? You know it from your children. You bring them up as a good Catholic. You've done everything possible to keep them Catholic. You've given them the best schools. You've given them the best of what you can in the faith. And you know, keeping them to the church is not the easiest thing in the world. In fact, it's real tough. We are facing an internal crisis in that there are some big warring factions within the church that believe that they're right and want to take the church in this way and that way and the other way. And will do anything to get their way within the church. And then we have the sex scandals, which are crazy, with cover-up and collusion and really despicable stuff that has sacrificed little children and exposed little children to what they should never be exposed to. And the pain of the little child who has been abused is a real pain that we must all carry. Because as Pope Francis said in his letter to the people of God, when one suffers, all of us suffer. When one is hurt, all of us are hurt. When one is abused, all of us are abused. And so the sufferings of one is our suffering. We are living with a suffering in the church today that is absolutely palpable. You feel it, you know it. But you know, in our gospel reading, when Jesus says that the Son of Man must suffer and die, the Son of Man must suffer and die, but on the third day he will be risen from the dead. All they heard is that he must suffer and die. They didn't hear that on the third day he will be risen from the dead. They didn't hear that part. We didn't hear that part. We call this the prediction of his passion. This is the prediction of his resurrection, not of his passion. Yeah, the passion is a prediction, but it is the resurrection that is the real news. Plenty of people in history have suffered and died. How many people have risen from the dead? You know anybody else? I don't know nobody else. So the prediction, the real news in the prediction is that 3 days after the suffering, he will rise from the dead. That's the real news. That the resurrection will follow the crucifixion. That's the real news. So even as we as church are going through our crucifixion now, by our own stupidity, by our own inept response to so much that has gone wrong, even as now we're going through our crucifixion, that we must hear the text of the gospel today, not just as the prediction of the crucifixion, but Calvary is a place where we have learned that death has no power over us anymore, because death gives way to the resurrection light of Jesus Christ. It gives way to that. And that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. That doesn't mean that we're going to have a wonderful time skipping and singing all the way to the cross. It doesn't mean that we're going to be cheery-eyed and lighthearted as we live through the next couple years, decades, or maybe centuries. Doesn't mean that. But what it does mean is that we must keep our eyes fixed on what he has said to us. And what he has said is that the Son of Man must suffer and die, put to death at the hands of sinful men. But on the third day he will rise again. Death, where is your sting? Death, where is your victory? Because the victory of death has been despoiled by the cross of Jesus Christ. And as we as church go through our own long crucifixion, a long way to Calvary, a long way to suffering, as we experience the suffering of being exposed in front of the whole world of this bunch of babbling fools who have done such great foolishness, as we experience that, we must know that even in the midst of this, that we, the people who love this church, must live in this time of crucifixion by understanding the time in which we are living, but by also understanding that death will give way to the resurrection light of Jesus Christ, and that death will not be the final say. As I listen to the text today, that second reading really speaks to the second drama that's happening in the church today. Where are these wars and ambitions coming from? You know, it's not as if it is bad enough that we have this thing, the sexual scandals that we're dealing with. But now we also have people of very high office who are plotting against our Pope. That's the only way I can say it. They're happy to see the demise of Pope Francis. And that can't be a Christian response. That can't be Christian. It can't be a Christian and a Catholic and believe that for whatever disagreement you have with him, that you want to see the demise of this man, of anyone. Because Jesus' response was, love your enemies and do good to them. Love your enemies and do good to them. And so if we're treating our enemies by trying to plot their destruction, we are not being Christian and we're not being disciples of Jesus Christ. If we're building internal friction in our church that is tearing the church and bringing disunity, we're not being disciples of Jesus Christ. There's a space for healthy disagreement in the church. There's always been. There's a space for people having different opinions in the church. There have always been. There's a space for people having very different opinions in the church. There's always been that. And we could agree to disagree about so many things. But there's a core of fundamentals that we can't disagree on. And the core fundamentals is that we must always treat each other with charity. And it is that charity that I'm most worried about in the church today. Because that charity is evaporating very quickly. By people who believe that they're right and believe what they believe. And rather than treating each other with charity, are building wars and destruction. And that's not on one side, that's on all sides. All of us, every one of us, have to ask ourselves the hard question. Am I being charitable with the people that I disagree with? We're living in a world right now that is so polarized that when we disagree with people, we don't only say I disagree, but we start calling them names. You realize that? Labeling them, writing them off. That's violence. That is violence. And there's a lot of violence that is happening that we have to take stock of. We have to come back to understand that it is love that was at the beginning. And it is only love that will be at the end. And all the way to Calvary, we have to find a way to be a people of love. All the way to Calvary. We have to find a way to be a people who will absorb this violence and give back love. All the way to Calvary, we have to find a way to keep our hope in the resurrection of Jesus Christ and know that the church too will experience this resurrection. We've been through this before. In the 400s, 500s, when the whole Western world collapsed in a most spectacular way, and the church with it. But before that, for 100 and something years, there was a group of people going into the desert, fleeing the cities and doing things in the desert. And they started because they just wanted some other way of living the faith. And then eventually those people in the desert, they became the renewal of the church and of Europe. That's the monastic movement. The ecclesial communities today have been prepared for this kind of renewal of the church. We might be living in the second half of Mark's gospel. And the Son of Man will be crucified. But on the third day, he will rise from the dead. As we come to Eucharist today, let us recognize that the crucifixion happened because people could not accept God when God came. And they threw their violence against God. That's why it happened. They believed that they knew better than God, and so they threw their violence at God. Violence is really the common thread in the crucifixion narrative, the one then and the one now. We have to be the people of nonviolence who absorb the very harsh rhetoric that we're hearing within our church, and inviting people back to the centrality of love and harmony and unity in the building up of the body of Christ. Amen.